All right, and we are at 3:21, and I do want to make sure that everyone has enough time to share. It should be that everyone can share their screens at this point as well. So if we want to go, we can go in speaking order, we can go out of speaking order, whatever is easiest for folks. Would it be easiest to just go in the order that folks are listed? Okay, let's do that. And I'm going to invite everyone to introduce themselves to the group. We probably will have folks joining in. So, you know, please folks join in. And for the oral presentations, I think we can drop questions in the chat box, but our speakers may not be responding to them right away, so it might take a minute. So I think Lisa and I will just work to kind of keep track of questions for when we have time for question and answer. So don't feel the need to stop your presentation, but we will come back to those if folks want to drop them there, because it helps you just to get them out of your head so you don't lose them. All right, so we will begin with our first speaker, please, Dr. Whitney McCoy.
Let me make sure I have myself unmuted now. Share my screen. All right. Okay, so my presentation is about bringing Black girls into engineering, what we can learn from their intersectional experiences. So currently, only 2% of African American women are scientists and engineers in the field, and they're influenced by the double bind or the undermining of their pursuit in the STEM careers based on them being Black and female. So what happens is, because this happens to Black women, on the lower level, Black girls' interest in STEM typically starts to decline around the 5th grade, and they have various stereotypes that may prevent them from visualizing themselves as scientists and engineers. And so this is some work from my dissertation study. And so the purpose of this study was to understand and examine the experiences of African-American adolescent girls in an informal summer engineering program using a mini ethnographic case study approach by exploring their racial identity, their engineering identity, and their STEM self-efficacy. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide just for time constraints, but my theoretical framework was based mostly in critical race theory and Black feminist thought. CRT, or critical race theory, looks to challenge inequity caused by race, law, and power. More specifically, I looked at racial permanence, which talks about the fact that race is a permanent construct in our society. Intersectionality, or those interlocking systems of oppression, which I know a lot of people have talked about today, and talking about class, race, gender, and then whiteness as property. Just in talking about, what allows us to gain privileges in our, U.S. society. And a lot of that is based in the fact that, when you're white, you may have more access to things. I also used Black feminist thought, which is an extension of feminism that looks at the taking for granted knowledge of Black women, racial identity, or the perception that a person may share with their heritage, engineering identity, which is their perception on their ability to be an engineer, and then STEM self-efficacy, or one's perception of their ability to complete a certain task in STEM. So this study took place at a large land-grant, predominantly white institution. The campers were charged a fee of $425 to attend. There were 6 teams of 12 campers, and they engaged in 9 engineering challenges or activities over the course of a week. And approximately 12% of the participants were Black girls over the course of 2 weeks. So the first research question was, how do African-American adolescent girls describe and navigate their multiple identities while participating in a summer engineering program? And the second question that I'll focus on today is, how do African-American adolescent girls view themselves in the context of a summer engineering program? So as you can see here, this is the participants that participated in this part of the study. There's an additional part of the study that I won't talk about today, where I also interviewed staff members, but I'm going to speak mostly today about the girls and their intersectional experiences. As you can see, these are the teams they participated on, their grade levels that they were going to be entering in the fall, their racial identities, their socioeconomic statuses, how many years they may have participated in this camp, and then if they receive financial assistance or not. So to collect the data, I began with collecting a demographic questionnaire. Then I followed up during the actual camp while they were engaging in the engineering challenges that were based on real life scenarios. I collected field notes. I took pictures of their engineering designs or those products that they created, engineering notebooks, and their images where they were actually like drawing and drafting those ideas of what they were actually going to design. And those designs ended up being, like, for example, if they were tasked with trying to create an apparatus to unclog an artery, they were using everyday materials like pipe cleaners, paper clips. So they're like everyday materials, but they're actually solving a real world problem. So at the end of each day of camp, they answered 3 questions using a voice recorder, which were called daily diaries. And after 5 days of doing that, I followed up with them at their homes or a location of their choice where they did a semi-structured interview. And then at the end of the semi-structured interview, they shared a self-expressive piece of art telling me how they viewed themselves in the camp setting. So I'm gonna now switch over. For my data analysis, I did a thematic analysis where I looked at the different themes that arose after analyzing all of the data. And so I began by sharing our first theme. I had 3 themes to share. So the first theme was I can do anything. And so this is where the girls talked about how despite any type of negative connotations that they had received about being a female or about being African American, they were still very much so encouraged. And so what I found was either they felt like they had this girl power, or they felt like they definitely connected to that double bind identity of being Black and girl. And so they talked about Black girl magic. And so on these slides, I've highlighted some of the things that pull out the theoretical connections. And I won't focus on all of the sub-themes just because of the time constraints, but I've left them up here so that you all can read them and read more into them. And then when the slides are shared, you can see them as well. So for this one, I'll focus on girl power. So Imani was a girl who had dyslexia, and she felt like camp was a way for her to use her art as a form of expression, which is also connected to Black feminist thought and intellectual activism. And so her team lead that she worked with at first felt like she needed to do more writing. But after a conversation with her, she understood how important it was to let this student express herself through art and not always require her to write down paragraphs about, what she had experienced. She said in a poem that she created for her art, I am a strong girl who likes to do art. I wonder what I'm going to become. I hear my amazing future as a woman. I see my painting as extraordinary. I pretend that I'm the strongest girl in the world. I worry about the weak power of a girl. And so moving on, I wanted to show just one of the self-expressive pieces of art where one of the girls drew a drawing. This is Genesis's art. She definitely felt like in the space that she was silenced and marginalized as a Black girl, in the fact that sometimes when she worked with white males, her perspective was not very much so listened to. But she still found a way to express herself and also connect with other Black girls. And so in the pictures, you'll see me, and then these are all other Black girls that she collaborated with during the camp. And she felt like together by working with them, she was able to find this thing called Black girl magic and also share her love for engineering and make herself a stronger engineer by making sure that she highlighted the fact that she was definitely successful in this setting despite other people trying to discourage her. The second theme looked at, am I what an engineer looks like? And so this is where they explored their engineering identity. In doing so, I had Zini. Zini talks about accepting the grand challenge. So we know that engineering is definitely white male dominated. And of course, a lot of times that property or that knowledge is also looked at as, being stapled by white men. And so I wanted to highlight that Zini said, engineers, they are men, they're also white men. And she also talks about the fact that they don't really listen to people. And that doesn't mean that they're nice or kind either. Along with that, Elise talks about the fact that, she felt silence in this setting. And so she talks about how a boy talked about how he had gone to aerodynamics camp and how, since you haven't been to aerodynamics camp, you can't help me with this airplane. And so now she's talking about how intellectual property rights or his knowledge is better than hers. And so he said, what you did was stupid. And she said he wouldn't really let me do anything. And she probably should have spoken up for herself, but it was really hard. So I'm going to skip the part about mathematics, but I'm going to go on to accessing a white space. And so Imani shared in the same theme, what our engineer looks like. She talks about the fact that she knew that this is not something that Black girls usually do because they can't afford it. And that's because at her school, she realized that Black girls typically got free food through this program called Backpack Buddies. And so you can see that she says, it feels really good that I can do this and my parents can't afford it. I know we can't afford it because I learned about all these different camps at school and they're a lot of money. We had Backpack Buddies to help people when they can't eat food, and a lot of Black girls got backpacks. So I learned that I'm really fortunate that I can do this. And so a lot of the girls continue to talk about how this white space is not for them and what we need to do to get more Black girls into this space. And so then the last theme looks like I can be a person in history. And this is where I explored the girls' racial pride for being Black and then also being female. So they talk about how they feel about being Black and how they feel like other people feel about Black women. So I'll highlight Genesis and disregarded but encouraged. So she said, they determine who you are based on your race. People come up to a white person and be like, oh my gosh, she's probably rich. Then people would go to a Black person and would be like, her dad's probably in jail. And so she continues to go on and talk about how, despite that, she feels like she can be a person in history, just like a hidden figure. And so that's why she is still encouraged to be in this space. Imani in the next theme, Changing the World by Becoming a Black Woman in STEM, she talks about how, she says, I think the color of my skin influences how I feel about myself because sometimes I wish I was white. And so she goes on and then talks about she feels like white women and white men get more than Black women do. And then lastly, we have Cora in Colorblind Realities, where she talks about how she didn't feel like her skin color mattered. And so she shared in her poem, I never feel alienated, alone, uncomfortable. In fact, I feel normal, no different than everyone else. I feel like I have a fair chance. And so this work just looks to highlight the fact that we need to be more aware of the intersection identities of Black girls, because of course this camp is there to help increase the amount of minorities and females in engineering, but lack of awareness of their identities and their intersectional identities can definitely be detrimental to them in the long run. And so we definitely need to look at also addressing structural inequity in informal engineering and STEM education. So more specifically, looking at program accessibility, who has access to these programs, who knows about these programs, and even looking at cost. And then lastly, looking at resiliency and protective factors among Black girls. So even though these girls were resilient, they did succeed in the camp, all of them said that they would return to the camp again and they would come every year. But in doing so, they also avoided, they use avoidance as a way to, mitigate these negative effects. And this can definitely have a major impact on their mental and physical health in the long run. And so this is just the significance of this work. It uses CRT and Black feminist thought to look at structural components of informal programs. By understanding our intersectional identities, we can see how these play a critical role on these girls' experiences. And engineering innovations can be more accurate when gender and race are considered. And then engineering identity development research can definitely lead to a diversified talent pool of Black women engineers. So I have a slide for questions, but I know we're saving questions for the end.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. And my apologies, I forgot to ask you to introduce yourself. I know you've just presented, but I would just love to hear your name, what you'd like to be called, kind of where you are right now, and pronouns, if you wouldn't mind.
Yes, so I'm Whitney McCoy. You can call me Whitney. She, her, hers. And I'm a I was a fourth year PhD candidate, but now I actually just defended about 2 weeks ago, so I'm finished. So I'm now
Congratulations.
so I'll be transitioning. I'll be at University of Virginia next year, doing a postdoc in engineering education.
Right. Thank you so
Wait,
much.
excuse me, Dr. McCoy. I'm so proud.
Woo-hoo!
Okay, bye.
Right, yeah, silent or out loud applause, because hurdles. All right, thank you so much. Okay, and so our next speaker, Kelsey DeFresne, and my apologies if I mispronounce your name. Are you here?
Yes, I'm right here. Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so if you would also, just before you begin, introduce yourself with those same things, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you all so much for being here virtually. I'm very excited about this conference, and I'm so excited to see all the flexibility with making this digital, because it's really important work. And so my name is Kelsey Dufresne. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm a grad student here at NC State in the English department. And I'll be presenting with my colleague, Paul.
Hi, Paul Watsoff right here. I'm an MFA student in creative writing fiction at NC State, but I also work in the education department, which is where I connected up with Kelsey.
The ice cream is an option door.
And so maybe to start, I'm going to try to share my screen. That way we can go ahead and talk through everything. Can you all see that okay? Great, okay. And so Paul and I are here today to talk to you about a lot of work that we do with the Literacy and Community Initiative. And our presentation today is called I Am a Part of This Dream, Publishing Student Narratives to Promote Equity in North Carolina.
Okay, so the Literacy and Community Initiative is a NC State program that this is our mission statement: to build university and community-based partnerships, amplifying student voices through student publication, advocacy, and leadership. Then how we do that is what Kelsey and I will be talking about today.
With these community-based organizations, and it's wonderful to see a lot of you virtually that we have been able to work with through the LCI, we follow the model of write, engage, and lead with the youth voices that we work with. And so we connect with community-based organizations in the triangle to try to promote equity and amplify and empower the voices of historically underserved and underrepresented North Carolina youth through publishing curriculum. And that's what we're going to try to talk to you a lot about today. And following the publishing of their writing, we go through and try to trace and identify patterns in their writing to see what these youth are discussing and what they're talking about in their writing. And ultimately, a research question is, what are the narratives of youth involved in community-based organizations?
Okay, so we connect with these community-based organizations to teach writing lessons with students. And we plan those writing lessons, we execute those writing lessons, and a critical pedagogy is behind everything that we do. And there's lots of different ways to define critical pedagogy and definitely to execute it in the classroom. But two, core elements of critical pedagogy that we keep in mind. One is really elevating the status of the student to co-investigator with the teacher, that what they bring to the table is what's important, so that we can, two, really challenge the myths that support disempowering social practices and inequality in society.
And so with that, and in trying to employ critical pedagogy and work with youth, these are the community-based organizations we work with here. And so Corral Writing Academy is based out of Cary, North Carolina. And you can see a photo there on the far left of the young girls that are part of Corral. And at Corral, they work with young girls that have been identified as at risk at school, and they do equine therapy to provide transformational change. Another community-based organization we work with is Juntos, which is actually now situated at DASA at NC State University. And that photo right there is the students at Quail Ridge Bookstore after their first book.
And we also have Bull City Youth Build, which is in Durham, North Carolina. And these are students around 16 to 20 years old who aren't currently in the, schooling system. Maybe they've dropped out or whatever the reason is, but students who want to get back, get their high school equivalency, and also learn job skills along the way.
And with these incredible partnerships that we have developed, we've written 6 books, and the students have created these different stories, and each one is a different anthology where they reflect on their experiences and their journeys.
Yeah, and these books, they're really, really important because the subject matter is the students. Mm-hmm. It's their writing, it's their experiences, it's their thinking. So by turning them into a book, the book actually represents that, what you think has value. This is serious. This is professional. This is important. And, also we think publishing these books and finishing a project, where you start something, you work on it over an extended period of time, and then you get this great project. It just builds a lot of confidence, and we hope that will then relate to other projects the students want to start.
And with this idea of not only critical pedagogy, but project-based learning, we work with our community-based organizations to develop a publishing curriculum. So on the left here, you'll see in the blue, yellow, and green, this is a snapshot of the publishing curriculum that we developed with Juntos NC. And Juntos works to support Latino students and immigrant students in North Carolina and also across the country to help them succeed in high school and succeed in going on to higher education. And so this curriculum was developed specifically for those students in mind. And on the right, you can see this is actually a snapshot of a writing lesson that the students then use to create their own story pieces. And so that writing sample or writing activity led to this piece. And so this is a writing piece, an autoethnography that was written by a student named Aldo, who just graduated from high school a year ago. And his piece is titled The School of Hard Knocks, an autoethnography diving into the truths about Hispanic dropouts. And he starts off this piece by exploring his own positionality here in the United States beyond being a high school student. And in Wake County, he looks to the entire United States, and he highlights a lot of the injustices present in our education system, while also offering ways that he thinks it could be improved, like offering more authentic and more accessible, diverse programs to reach the diverse body of learners. And so in doing this and exploring some of the injustices and inequities in education that he's identified and that he researched, he argues for reform the school system, and he says that this must be done to provide education for everybody, means that it's shared without prejudice of class or race. And he says that he's advocating against this issue because I believe everyone deserves a second chance.
And another writing lesson that we do is, what does this program mean to you? And I've pulled just a few student testimonials up on the screen. I don't have time to read them all out loud, but there are 2 themes that really hold strong without these. One is that they're a dissatisfaction with traditional schooling for one reason or another, a belief that the student wasn't going to succeed in the traditional schooling. And then through these programs, just a lot of hope. You see students talk about second chances, believing in the future that they can get things done, that they can go on to college. Really positive.
And with that, we have identified several findings with this process with employing critical pedagogy through the method of having project-based learning in a publishing curriculum where youth authors around the high school age are able to publish books. And some students have contributed to a couple books at this point. And so through this process, we find that the students engaging in our model of writing, engaging, and leading, writing is able to be an accessible tool or vehicle where they can reflect on themselves, reflect on their journeys and the journeys of their families, as well as that of their communities. So where they're living, where they're going to school, the communities of their community-based organization like Juntos or like Youth Build and like Corral. And they're also using this opportunity with writing to advocate for betterment for themselves, for their families, and just betterment for our country. And so they write about their foundations and journeys, demonstrating their resilience and strength, highlighting the strength of their community.
And there's a real great potential for further scholarship based off of these students' writing and experiences, especially when you think of writing instruction in the K-12 level of education. And when you think of the prescriptive nature that writing instruction at the K-12 level has become due to standardized tests where it's more about conventions and organization and rhetoric than it is content, these students really see themselves and feel great pride, and that gives them confidence in what they're doing. And I think that's a great testament to the power of expressive writing and the need of expressive writing in the K-12 setting.
And especially at this time too, so expressive writing and in a time in our world where youth voices are starting to draw increasingly more attention. So it's wonderful to be able to listen to these voices and to have these youth voices out in the world. And so I think we're saving questions for the end, but here's a photo of some of our student authors at a reading celebration, because not only are we with the students in developing a curriculum and helping them to edit and write their pieces, but they also have a large celebration every year to celebrate their voices, because as Paul has mentioned, this is a huge accomplishment to publish a book, to finish a book. And so it's a very celebratory event and endeavor.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
All right, thank you all too. I just wanted to amplify what Angela said in the chat box too. For anyone who wants to make sure to locate a question or comment, please feel free to use that chat feature. We'd love to have that. If you're keeping your questions to yourself, also fine. And we'll go on to our next speaker or speakers. Next, it looks like we have Olivia Neal. So whenever you are ready.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Let me just figure out how to do that.
Just be sure to introduce yourself. If you want to do it at the same time, great.
Sure. There we go. Okay, oops. Start from the beginning. Okay, so bring this up. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this virtual event. I'm really excited to be able to present today. My name is Olivia Neal, and I graduated from UNC Chapel Hill in 2019. And I was an English major with a concentration in creative writing and a second major in women's and gender studies. So the research that I'm presenting today is a piece of original feminist theory that I developed through my coursework as a capstone project for my women's and gender studies major. I am now a grant writer for Planned Parenthood South Atlantic in Chapel Hill. So that's where I'm coming from. And I thought that this would be a really unique and awesome opportunity to share my research a little bit outside of the scope of UNC and the classwork that I did as a student. And I think that it has a lot of implications for broader use, so I wanted to kind of bring that to the community. So my presentation is called Radical Recovery, Healing from Sexual Violence as Feminist Action. So I think that we can all agree that sexual violence can have a really deep and lasting impact on individuals who experience it, survivors, and the community as a whole. And I think that it carries a sort of socialized response of silence and self-doubt that can shape a person's sense of self and sense of community as well. And I think it's also a tool of oppressors in keeping marginalized groups in a place of suffering and subjectivity. So understanding the ways that violence impacts victims and how they choose to recover, I think is critical to resisting oppressive forces, because it's undoing some of those important tools. And I wanted to give some context as to how I'm approaching this. Because it's a unique type of research, I want to examine sort of my approach to this research. And I want to start by saying that I came to this from a place of subjectivity and as a survivor of sexual violence myself. And in order to do this work justice, I felt it was necessary and beneficial to acknowledge my own lived reality. I am modeling this research after existing works of feminist theorists who have laid a groundwork for that. And in doing this research, have come across a lot of personal narratives and insertions into research. And so I'm modeling my approach after that. And so I believe that emotions and personal narratives have a place in scholarship. And that's, of course, kind of the theme today, I think. And I think that the line between affect and objectivity has been drawn largely by men within academic spheres. So to me, part of creating feminist theory is, purposefully deconstructing that line. At the same time, I also want to acknowledge that my perspective is not representative of all survivors or of all activists. There are, of course, kind of layers of marginalization that impact sexual violence in the way that it impacts individuals and communities. And while I do identify with some of the groups who are disproportionately impacted, as a queer woman, as a former college student, as someone who grew up in a low-income household, but there are a number of communities that I don't belong to that are disproportionately impacted, and I want to acknowledge that. Women of color, especially Black and Native American women, are disproportionately impacted and experience sexual violence. And so do transgender folks, and I don't belong to those communities. So I want to acknowledge that ultimately my theory is grounded in my own experiences, and I'm not going to attempt to speak for other groups who might be impacted by this issue. So I just wanted to give a little bit of context as to how I approached this in the beginning. Ultimately, this project starts with my own experience and enters the conversation with other feminist scholars who have spoken about this. And it also, there's a necessary element of this research in expanding the definition of activism. That's really my main thesis behind this research, is broadening our concept of what activism is and can be. So most of the time when people say activism, they're talking about protests, marches, letter writing campaigns, these sort of collective actions that take place outside the home in community spheres among groups of people. But I did some research into how different people have defined activism over the years and found an article by Naomi Abrahams that connects everyday actions with broader political processes. And I'm sort of borrowing that understanding of activism for the purposes of my research, because I think that it is important to value the everyday and the habitual lived experiences as a mode of activism and as something that we can explore with regards to sexual violence and recovery. So So I can't delve into every single point that I made in my initial capstone research because due to time, but I did want to touch on some of the key theorists whose work that I built upon and that I felt was really fundamental to my understanding of the research. So first we have a more recent example. Sarah Ahmed wrote the book Living a Feminist Life. I believe it was published in 2017. And this book explores the way that feminism can be enacted through a daily mindset and approach to everyday actions. So that was really helpful in forming my framework for what individualized activism looks like. And then going back a little bit further in the 1980s, we have Shreya Moraga and Gloria Anzaldua's This Bridge Called My Back, and particularly a concept that Moraga developed called the theory in the flesh. And I'll read a quick quote from the book. She says, theory in the flesh means one where the physical realities of our lives, our skin color, the land or concrete we grew up on, our sexual longings, all fuse to create a politic born out of necessity. So that quote kind of drove my understanding of this idea, which is that our physical realities influence our political realities and vice versa. And so not only is political personal, but it is also physical. And so that was a helpful guide and jumping off point for my research. And then I also worked with the text Not That Bad by Roxane Gay. This one is again more recent in the last few years. And she published this book sort of as a reflection on the Me Too movement, but it is a collection of personal essays from survivors of sexual violence, exploring what happened to them and their recovery process. And so this was an important text, and then I wanted to into the fold experiences other than my own when it comes to recovery and what that looks like, so that I could kind of take a broader look at what the commonalities are in what survivorship means and how it's conducted, what recovery looks like for different people. So that was one text that I used for that. And then Audre Lorde's Poetry is Not a Luxury really helped me to understand the ways in which emotion and art as a representation of emotion are important, not just in and of themselves as art, but also to, they are a survival method for people who live within an oppressive structure, and that it's important to value that and important to value emotions in activism. So those are sort of the key texts that I was working with, and where I started in looking at feminist theory. So I wanted to just touch on this quote from Sarah Ahmed's work that I think was a really short, sweet, and key representation of my point, which is, it is rebellious to fight for life when you have been given such a deadly assignment. So essentially what I took from that is that when you live within a societal context that expects you to experience violence and to stay silent, to kind of work against that is rebellious. So that's sort of one of the main ideas that I wanted to touch on. Basically, every survivor and every activist struggles to live within this system that embeds violence against women into our culture, that fails to convict perpetrators, that disbelieves and ridicules survivors. And so the system is not one that encourages survivors to thrive, or even allows them the space to heal without re-traumatizing them. And that keeping survivors from accepting what has happened to them and healing to move forward benefits perpetrators and benefits the system, and so the system enforces that reality. So therefore, because of that, recovering in a political and social context that is actively trying to keep people from recovering is a radical form of political resistance. And I argue that this action of believing and caring for oneself is revolutionary for those who have come to face to face with this type of violence and the systemic issues that go into that type of violence, and working to emerge from the sort of self-doubt, external criticism, and uncertainty that comes from those experiences. And I also want to say that violence is a tool of oppression. It is one of the most powerful tools that exist to keep dominant groups having power and to keep things in the status quo. And so to grow and thrive despite experiencing that violence is to undermine the effectiveness of that tool and render it fallible to the strength and resistance of survivors. So those are sort of the main arguments that I have developed as a result of my research and examining other feminist theorists. And then I want to touch on a few other elements that I talked about in my work and that I think are also important to note. One of the ways that this kind of translates into real activist work and the way that it's conducted is not only encouraging self-care in activist spaces, because I do think that that's becoming more and more prevalent, but also recognizing that self-care in and of itself may be a mode of activism that should be respected as such, because that changes the framework from not just you can't pour from an empty cup, but also acknowledging that that is its own difficult work and that it is valuable work in and of itself. And then, so of course, if recovery is a form of activism, what is it? What does recovery mean? What type of actions constitute recovery? So I analyzed a lot of different stories from different survivors about their recovery, and as well as psychological texts that deal with the psychological approach to recovery. What happens when we recover? What happens when we experience trauma? And I found a lot of commonalities between survivors as far as what recovery looks like and what types of actions they took. So I won't go through all of them, but for an example, seeking safety, of course, is an important step in recovering because it's very difficult to recover in a context in which you are still unsafe. So that is really a key step in recovering that is also a part of activism. And then also a lot of survivors that I found, an important part of that process was meaning making. And so understanding what happened, not just in a broader context, and trying to understand it and make meaning out of it and move forward with that understanding. And for a lot of people that resulted in helping other survivors, because a lot of the conclusion that people come to is, okay, this means that I now have the opportunity to help others. And so, of course, that's kind of like pour from an empty cup method thinking, where like you can't fully show up for others unless you show up for yourself first. So by focusing on our own recovery, we open up opportunities not only to model that recovery for others who are struggling, but also to later have the capacity to assist others on their journeys as well. And then I also talked a lot about the ways that art, as a way of verbalizing these actions and making them available to others, is also a type of activism in communicating to others that they're not alone, and in demonstrating to the greater community that this violence is not infallible and can be overcome. So those are kind of the concepts that I developed through this research. I also, as an accompaniment, developed a self-care journal for survivors to help with that mode of self-expression. And so that was sort of the more physical part of the project. If you're interested in that, I think that I still have a digital copy. But so I wanted to summarize with this line from my work, which is, understanding sexual violence recovery as a vital mode of activism is not just a theoretical approach to the systems of rape culture and patriarchy, but also informs practice within activist communities and benefits the important work being done to dismantle these powerful destructive forces. So that's the conclusion of my presentation, and I know that we are taking questions after everyone's done, so I would be happy to answer any questions then. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Really appreciating these through lines of affect and art and time. Okay, so our next presenters are Kim Stansberry, Natalie Ames, Erica Campbell, and Christy Bird. Everybody present and accounted for? And so if you all could just do quick introductions, because we do still want to see and appreciate and know you, and then however you all are doing your presentation together. Thanks.
It's just me presenting, Kim Stansberry. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Okay. I am Kim Stansbury. I go by the pronouns what she, her, and hers. I am an associate professor and the director of the graduate program in the Department of Social Work, soon to be the School of Social Work. So we're excited about that. I have two other colleagues working on this research. However, they couldn't be here. So I'm the main presenter today, main and only presenter today. So, and I want to thank you for transitioning, the face-to-face conference to virtual, because I'm excited to present this research. All right, so the title of my research is African American Clergy, Domestic Violence Prevention and Intervention Planning Project. Purpose of the presentation is to provide a background on domestic violence in the African American community, discuss the importance of African American clergy and the church and their role in the prevention and intervention of domestic violence, highlight findings from a current study, and explore ways to translate these current findings into action. And this is my research team, Dr. Natalie Ames, who's in the Department of Social Work at NC State, and Dr. Erica Campbell, who's in the School of Social Work at Fayetteville State University. And so generally I always ask, especially if I'm doing this face-to-face in person, what do these women have in common? Well, what they have in common is they all are deceased and they were killed in the context of domestic violence. And domestic violence is a pattern of assaultive behavior that includes repeated battering and injury, psychological abuse, sexual assault, progressive social isolation, and deprivation and intimidation. And what you find is that these behaviors are usually perpetuated by someone they knew or were involved in an intimate relationship with. But we've also had cases where some women didn't know the person who killed them. So it's not always the case that they're involved in these intimate relationships. Also, when it comes to domestic violence, it's all about power and control. When it comes to domestic violence, the rates for African American women are 35% higher than that of their white counterparts. And African American women are most likely to be killed in a domestic violence situation. The fatalities are higher in African Americans than any other racial ethnic group. African American who are in domestic violence situations, they're less likely to seek mainstream assistance. They're less likely to go to a domestic violence shelter or go to an agency such as Interact, which is located in Raleigh. However, they're more likely to turn to the church and clergy for assistance. But the few studies that are out there demonstrate that clergy have little knowledge and few skills for responding to domestic violence. Also, too, when it comes to social services agencies, their funding is being cut yearly. And with their funding being cut yearly, we're going to find that the church, African American churches, are going to be increasingly important resources in their communities because people are going to turn to the clergy and the church for assistance. We did this study because when we looked at the literature, we realized there's a paucity of studies out there when it comes to the role of African American clergy in the prevention and intervention of domestic violence. And so we wanted to know, what are their opinions, what are their knowledge, and what are their experiences with DV in their congregations? So we did it was pretty much, we say mixed methods we did. It was qualitative and it also was quantitative. But today I'm only gonna report on the qualitative data. And we we interviewed 20 pastors and we used a semi-structured interview guide. And we interviewed clergy who were located in Durham, Wake, and Cumberland County. And the questions we asked were their common label for violence, what were their encounters with domestic violence in their congregation, And if they did encounter it, what was their course of action? Their ability to recognize abuse, their beliefs on the causes of domestic violence, and last, what's the role of themselves and the church in the prevention and intervention of domestic violence? So, like I said, we completed 20 face-to-face interviews and also 20 completed surveys. When it comes to the characteristics of the sample, 25% were female, 75 male. The ages range, as you see, from the youngest 23 to 71 years old. 100% was, identified as Black or African American, which was a criteria to participate in our study. Also, too, they were highly educated. 45% had a master's degree, 30 a doctorate, 10% a Bachelor of Science, and 5% had some graduate school education, a graduate school experience. 41% identified as Baptist, 29% non-denominational, 12% African Methodist Episcopal, and 6% were progressive Pentecostal. And so the research team, we used thematic analysis to come up with our themes for our study. We asked, before we started, we actually got into our in-depth questions. We asked, what is a common label for violence? Because when you look in the literature, you see a lot of studies use intimate partner violence. So we wanted to know a common terminology, because it's important when you do community work to find out what language are they using as well. And 100% of the clergy were most familiar with domestic violence over intimate partner violence. And the first theme, it touches on, encounters with domestic violence. And why is it a silent epidemic in the African American community? And so theme 1 is keeping up appearances. 9 out of 20 reported encounters with domestic violence. And they also stated that a lot of times people do not come forward because you're not supposed to air your dirty laundry to others. And historically, you kept home. And I remember as a young child growing up, my grandmother always said, what happens in the home stays in the home. You did not air your dirty laundry. You did not speak about what was going on inside your home. So I could definitely relate to this theme, which is keeping up appearances as if nothing is going on. And then the second theme, we asked them about their encounters and could they recognize it. And theme 2 is hurt bleeds through. Hurt bleeds through. They was like, even if a person in their congregation doesn't say anything, and this was some of the pastors, not all, but many said they can still sense an abusive relationship. And they stated that it's extremely important to know the people in your congregation. In some of the smaller churches, it was interesting because the pastor said that when he would take the pulpit, it was one particular pastor, he said, I can look in my pulpit and I know where people sit because that's where they sit weekly. And he's like, at the end of service, I always make sure I shake their hand in the end because I want to have that personal connection with my congregants. Also, too, they spoke about the importance of verbal and nonverbal cues. One pastor gave the example of he had a young woman who was always jubilant, who was always in a good mood, and who was always happy. Especially when she didn't bring her boyfriend to church. Where he noticed that when her boyfriend would attend church with her, she was extremely quiet. She didn't have much to say. It was almost as if her personality had diminished, and he knew something was wrong, and he questioned it. And so when they became aware that something was going on, they would attempt to counsel, and it wasn't like true pastoral counseling. It was more along the lines of pastoral care, and it was their preference to refer out because they didn't feel comfortable providing counseling services to someone in a domestic violence context. Also, too, we wanted to know, why do you think domestic violence continues and has a strong hold in the Black community? And the third theme was generational transmission. And a majority of the pastors stated, hurt people hurt people. If you've been hurt, it's what you know. And you have a tendency to be conditioned, and you're conditioned to provide that hurt as well. It's learned behavior to them, and it's transmitted from child to their future family, and so the cycle lives. The cycle is continuous. The fourth theme was, because we asked them, so what is the role of you in the Black church? And they stated need for training and education. And they stated that churches need to be proactive. They also stated that they needed education because a lot of them had been to seminary. However, they had not received any training on how to deal with real life issues such as domestic violence. And they thought that was extremely lacking. So they knew that they were in need of training assistance. A lot of them didn't feel qualified to counsel, so they referred out. They had a list that they would refer their congregants to. The key thing is it had to be somebody who specialized in the area, but they also had to be Christian counselors. That was extremely important to them. Also, they wanted to partner with those in the community who had expertise in domestic violence to help them deal with, their congregants, to help them to educate their congregation on domestic violence and the importance of, if you're in these situations, to make sure you get the help that you need, that there are resources out there available to them. And so what's next when it comes to our project? Well, we're submitting a grant tomorrow. So we're applying for grant funding because what we want to do is we want to engage the participants who agreed to participate in our study and interact and other African American clergy in virtual focus groups, because it's our goal to, we want them to lead us. And when I say lead us, we want them to help us develop a domestic violence toolkit that can be utilized in congregations statewide to highlight the importance of domestic violence, what's going on, but also to let people know that help is available. And, I've been, since COVID-19 has occurred, we have seen that domestic violence shelters have seen an increase in the number of calls, the number of domestic violence calls. So it's extremely important that we put something in place, an intervention in place, so we can help victims so they know that there is help out there. But I jumped ahead, but we're finalizing the report that we plan to give to our participants. And quite a few participants noted when we interviewed them that they would be happy to be on a design team to help us develop this domestic violence toolkit. So we're excited about moving into phase 2. Even if we don't secure grant funding, we still plan to move into phase 2. So I want to acknowledge, my college, the College of Humanities and Social Sciences Research Office, because they gave us initial funding for this project, and also the study participants who graciously gave of their time to assist us with this project. And I know that we're holding questions to the end, and I look forward to addressing your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. All right, I misspoke before, so my apologies. Christy Bird actually has separate research from this project, so that was my error. I had things in the wrong order. So Christy Bird, whenever you're ready to introduce yourself and begin, thank you so much.
Thanks. So I am Christy Bird. I'm assistant professor in the College of Education, and use she, her, hers pronouns. And I am going to be talking about our extension project, which is called #PastorMikeYouth. And our goal is to amplify youth voices through our podcast and blog. And so also joining me is one of our hosts and co-producers, Luke Sheely. So I'll just let him introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. I use he, him pronouns. I work with Christy and a few other people on this project. There's 3 youth as well in total.
Thanks. So let me start my timer before I forget. So just a little overview of what I'm going to be talking about. What is #PassTheMicYouth? Our theoretical framework that we're developing, and then how you all can get involved with what we're doing. And then we'll have questions at the end. So #PassTheMicYouth is a youth-led, youth-centered podcast and blog that seeks to amplify the voices of young people by sharing their lived experiences and stories of activism. So we focus on young people broadly defined from, kids, middle schoolers, all the way up to college students, and we have some graduate students working with us as well. And the goal of the project is really to show young people that they can be activists, and whatever that means to them. They can develop their ideas about how they want to change the world, and they can actually change the world. So I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like later, but just introduce you to some of the people who are working with us. I'm one of the faculty directors along with Maru Gonzalez, who's in the College of Agriculture. And our producers and hosts are Luke, Nuira, and Mateen. I think Mateen is also on the call. And we had a host last year who joined us and who is graduating this year, Sam Chan, who helped us launch everything. So we have a really great team. This is the core team. We also have some other faculty members, some teachers, and some graduate students who are also helping us with other aspects of the project as well. So where does all start with Maru, who was trained as a school counselor and who has been working in community organizations for a long time. And what she wanted to do was to understand how do youth understand activism and how they get involved in their community. And then what do they want adults to know about supporting them in their efforts to do activism. And what she found was that the youth said, when it comes to supporting us, we want you to pass the mic. So that was the impetus for starting this project. And when Maru came to NC State a few years ago, she and I connected kind of randomly, actually, but we discovered we had these common interests in understanding youth activism. And she roped us all in, and we're now been doing this project for about 1.5 years. Yeah, that's true. So the idea of it being a youth-led and youth-focused podcast this is Heart Slatter. This really shows how youth can be involved in organizations or in initiatives. And our idea is to not have youth in these sort of lower level kinds of token participation, like, oh, we have this, sort of, they give input, but we don't really listen to them. We want our project to be youth initiated in the sense that our hosts and co-producers, they are the ones deciding what topics we focus on. They do most of the work of recording and doing actually all of the work of recording and doing the interviews. The faculty members, we really kind of help them think about, well, what might be other opportunities? Who can we connect with, like the LCI? And we provide the funding for them, we pay them. But it really is an initiative where our students are running the show. Their input is extremely valuable. Their insights, their understanding of what activism is, they're teaching us every single day about what it means to be an activist. And I will also say that's true for the people who are submitting and who are in the blog and on the podcast, because they also are teaching us this is what it means to be an activist in this day and age. So this is just the idea to show you that when we say youth-led, it is truly youth-led. So here is a screenshot of our website, passthemicYouth.com. So our website is really the sort of epicenter of all of our resources. So we have links to the podcast, of course, all of our episodes. We have a blog where we feature different voices talking about their involvement in activism, both youth and adults who work with youth. We have resources for educators, and now we have a section of resources for parents as well if they want to help have students, find their voice or to work on different projects and different resources about different social justice topics as well. So I want to play you a trailer for our first season. Let me know if you can't hear this.
I don't think we can underestimate or undervalue the power of activism and the role that it played in manifesting those beneficial societal changes.
Young people are change makers, visionary, courageous, optimistic, getting things done, leaders, and activists. We all have a story to share. It's time to pass the mic. Join us, Laura Nielsen, Luke Shealy, and Sam Chan on #PassTheMic as young people involved with all aspects of activism share their story because our voices matter.
And she had gone through this. And like now I'm seeing that in like a different lens, not just hearing about it or like reading about it in history books, but I'm like living in it.
And you're just lucky to even have these opportunities. And I just came out of class and I was crying. I'm like, they did it, like they did it. I remember my response was to be.
In order to be an activist, you have to acknowledge any privilege you may hold yourself and find ways to utilize said privilege to lift up voices that are currently marginalized.
On season 1 of #PassTheMic Youth, we're examining youth activism through the lens of the immigrant experience. Find us wherever you listen to podcasts.
Check out our website, PassTheMicYouth.com, for blog posts, educator resources, and to learn more.
This podcast is made possible by NC State Extension, but does not necessarily reflect its views.
So I have to have a little disclaimer. But I want to really tell you about just a range of things that we focused on. So our first season looked a lot at the immigrant experience. We had students who were traveling. So we had a student who traveled back to the country that her parents were from and ended up getting in the middle of a protest, and how she talked to her mother about what it meant to protest and to try to be an activist, and how she thought about that in terms of her own living in the United States and what she wants to work for here and back there. We've had one of our most recent episodes is about a person who is transgender and cataloged their journey on YouTube and what it meant for them to sort of have this public transition experience. We've interviewed the kids at Juntos. They are amazing. And we're planning to work with the other groups in the LCI as well. And then we've had episodes about school resource officers and should they be in schools, and activism in fashion. I think you heard Dominique in the trailer talk about what does it mean for her to be an activist through creating clothing and fashion. So we really run the gamut of kind of activist issues, and the goal of it is to really show youth that they can be an activist in a lot of different ways. It doesn't necessarily mean one way of getting involved in changing systems. It's really about what is it that you are passionate about and what are the skills and the opportunities that you have to be involved. Most of our episodes feature the host interviewing someone about their experiences with a particular initiative, and then the host will discuss their reactions to the story. So you get these two sides of a person sharing their experience, but also the host kind of commenting and giving their sense of connecting it to other experiences as well. And then a lot of times we will have submissions that will feature, which will be like a poem or a piece of music that will be shared in episodes as well. And then we have these smaller episodes called mic drops, where it's just more of like a snippet of a conversation or just a smaller thought piece about a particular topic. So that's kind of what the podcast is like. I want to spend maybe 2 minutes talking about our theoretical framework. So as we're working on this, what we're trying to do is also to be able to show that this is supported by the theory. And you've heard about critical pedagogy and critical theory a little bit already. So we are following along in those traditions as well. We're starting from the perspective of positive youth development, which is this idea that when youth's environments have these 5 C's over here: caring, competence, connection, and character. When those environments support those 5 things, then students are able to really have that 6th C of contribution, right? So that's positive youth development. But we wanted to bring in a critical lens and say it's not just about sort of the individual focus on, okay, well, I'm supported, I'm good, so now I'm going to go help my community. In order to help the community, you really need to have this idea of the structural level as well, and you need the opportunities to develop your critical consciousness. So that's where we bring in the idea of critical reflection and political efficacy, which are some of the ideas from critical theory that talk about how do people understand structural inequality and how do they feel like they can address structural inequality. So it's really, we argue that it's really necessary for schools, for community organizations, for parents even, to cultivate these critical consciousness, this critical consciousness in youth in order to not just have that individual contribution to their community, but really to lead to societal change. And so we are expanding the idea of contribution as not just sort of what I individually can do for my community, but how can I be a leader in my community and be a transformative leader, someone who inspires others to also be change makers. And then how can we take that critical action, which will actually lead to structural change. And then the idea, of course, is that youth who get involved in their communities through these kind of contributions will reinforce these environments for themselves and for other people. So this is really the way that we're thinking about what youth need in order to become change makers, and how can schools and community-based organizations provide that for you. And a lot of this is based on the idea of storytelling, which is what we think of hashtag Pass the Mic Youth, as the opportunity for people to tell their stories. And that can be a really useful tool as a way to help you notice what's going on in society, and to really think about what can I as an individual do, and how can I connect with people who are also interested in the same topics that I'm interested in. So hashtag Pass the Mic Youth is really embedded within this framework of critical positive youth development. And so now, in the last minute, I want to talk to you about how you can get involved. So first off, listen to the podcast, passthemicyouth.com. We are on all social media, so you can follow us, like our posts, and we will post little pictures. We'll post news from other sources. And so that's a great way to follow us. But if you really want to get involved and be possibly in the blog or on the podcast, and you can submit, we have our submission page. We're looking for things from any youth, really. So people who have something to say, let us know, and we'll figure out a way that we can integrate it into what we're doing. We have a really special project going on right now that I want Luke to talk about, which is the Isolation Activism Art Challenge.
Yeah, one of the things that we talk a lot about on the podcast is how art can be a form for activism, and has long been a tool for protest and for connection and for unity between different groups and people. So while it may be more difficult for people to come together and to have conversation and to unite and be in solidarity with one another, we wanted to use this opportunity to reach out to people and ask them, what are you passionate about right now? And give them this platform to share something that they've created, whether it's visual art, poetry, maybe music, and put that all together. And that's what this art challenge is. So our theme for it is hope, and we've been working with, I think we launched it yesterday, actually. So it's very new, and it's just through the month of April. So at the end of the month, we're going to be bringing all these pieces together and posting them on the web, and maybe doing something a little bit further with them to combine them all. So we've already had a few different submissions so far, and it's been great to see what people have come up with and created.
Thanks. So some of the other things on the website, like I mentioned, we have our educator and a parent toolbox and some critical curriculum resources. And we're also developing a curriculum. So Kelsey talked about they're creating a publishing curriculum. We are creating a curriculum based around people recording their stories. So we're really excited about all the work that's going on in the College of Education and elsewhere around these topics and around youth activism. So we're just hoping to slide our little piece in there as well. So we'll have time for questions at the end, but I want to thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Love seeing all these connections as well. All right, we have our last presenters before we get to questions. And we have Beth Wright-Fath and Joan Nichols Walker. All right, let's see. So if you all want to unmute, just introduce yourself and start presenting whenever you are ready.
Hello, everyone. I am Joan Nichols Walker. I am an assistant teaching professor, new to NC State this year. I go by the pronouns she, her, hers. And I'll let Beth introduce herself.
Sorry, I was still muted. Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, that's the first time I've done this, so congratulations to me. So I'm Beth Wright-Fath. I'm the Associate Teaching Professor and Department Head for Health and Exercise Studies here at NC State. And we're going to be talking about navigating, and she, her, hers pronouns. And we're going to be talking about navigating racially charged subject matter in the classroom. Excuse me. And this is a pretty abbreviated version of a presentation that Joan and I did with another colleague in, was it February?
Yes.
It seems like 3 years ago at this point, sorry. In February at the Collegium for African Diasporic Dance. So it's an international peer-reviewed conference that has movement presentations and research and pedagogy and performance and all sorts of things related to the African diaspora, which is pretty awesome. And what we're going to talk about today is sort of a culmination of practices that we've been working on. Joan, feel free to jump in we'll go with decades of experience teaching dance in predominantly white institutions, mostly in the Mid-Atlantic and the South. Does that seem pretty accurate? We've both been working on aspects of this and went through a program that helped us put some more formalized structure around it. So that's what we'll talk a little bit about today. Let me see. Click. All right.
So the subject matter, as you see on the screen, this is just some of them. When in our dance courses, we end up talking about slavery, racism, colonialism, representation. I can say specifically that in my jazz courses and tap, for instance, those two dance forms are American dance forms, but they are largely influenced by African slaves that were brought to the United States. Not to give you a history lesson, but just to say in part that not only their presence and their bringing their culture and dance traditions with them and influencing these dance forms of jazz and tap, but also the treatment of slaves. For instance, when drums were taken away from slaves and the rhythm having to transfer from those drums to the body and then to the feet, that is exactly how we got to a lot of what we know today as jazz dance and tap dance. So in educating my students about jazz and tap, I have to give them that historical perspective. So we have to talk about slavery. We also talk about racism, minstrels. That was the popular art form for over 50 years in the United States, and the appearance of blackface and everything that went along with it, that heavily influenced what became theatrical jazz dance today. So again, in educating students, they need to, I feel like I can't just teach them the steps. I have to tell them the where and the how and why these steps developed.
Yes, and from a bigger picture standpoint, in terms of people talking about curriculum today, so from a curricular standpoint, historically in higher ed specifically, the Western European derived art forms are valued higher than they're higher in the hierarchy than other forms of dance. You see that in the movement classes, for instance, if you're typical dance minor or major or graduate program, you're going to focus on usually modern dance that's derived from Western European history. When you're learning about the history of those, you primarily are talking about white people and the white history. You might take other forms that are from the diaspora, but they're not typically required. And just to give ourselves a little promo, we do have a dance minor here at NC State. It's fairly new. And when we put the minor together, we were very intentional in trying to, in not repeating what has been done historically. And we wanted to make, so of all of the dance forms that we have multiple levels, those are all equally valued to help you fulfill your movement requirements. And then all of the theory courses and creative courses also are, we try to move away from colonialism and representation. Sorry. So, sorry, I lost my place for a second. So for instance, we usually see colonialism in what you look at in dance history as well in the curriculum. So it's usually going to be just covering ballet and modern dance, and usually again those from a Western European derived history. If you go to a traditional dance major or minor somewhere else and you take dance history, it starts with the Greeks, which we all know that's really not where dance started. Right. Yeah, I'll stop there. We'll go to the next slide.
So Beth and I both attended, I don't know if anyone else on here did, the really great race awareness workshop with Al Vivian. I went this past year, Beth went the year before, and Al talked about the identity development models. And so after I went to the workshop, I started to really think about how I could use this in the classroom. In terms of meeting my students where they are, because I, as an African-American professor at mostly predominantly white institutions, and I had this conversation with Beth, and this is why we kind of decided to join together and talk about this. Our experiences, we have different experiences, but when I in the past, and just a few weeks ago, brought up these topics in the class, I've had responses have been varied, but largely speaking, a lot of my students are not students of color, and they become immediately uncomfortable. It's like almost like the first time I'm sure they recognize, but they're like, oh wow, my teacher is Black, so this is a little awkward. And I don't want them to have that awkwardness. It is what it is. We are who we are. And the information is the information, and it has to be shared. I feel adamantly, again, like I said earlier, they need to know where these dance forms come from. They need to know the history and how things have been treated. And I tell them, you're in a unique situation in that one class, unlike my training in dance, all my degrees are in dance, it was very Eurocentric. And my goal is to right that wrong and to make them well-rounded and very educated. But anyway, so getting to the identity development models, you can see here on the slide the why and what they do. The designing to illustrate just a natural development of a person's self-identity. So again, we're looking at the student's, self-identity. Shows how a person views their own cultural group in comparison to another. helps you understand the mindset. That's the big thing that I hooked on to, and then advises you in how to assist that person. So we want to meet our students where they are developmentally and not shove them forward, but gently kind of push in a way. But you have to know where you're starting from, and then deliver that material. And again, it's not sugarcoating it, but there's a way and a way of doing it. And we're always learning and growing, but we've been discussing and talking about different strategies, which we'll share with you.
And there were multiple stages, but we felt in Al's work, but we felt these were the main stages that we see our students in. And these are broken down by mindset, typical statements, advantages, disadvantages, and supports. I think we were saying many of our students are either in the contact or disintegration stage. Some we have in the reintegration stage and some farther, but these are the main areas. And so while we recognize that people are always coming from different places, we try to really look at these as helping us guide how we guide the students.
Right, so those supports are really important. So for the first one, the contact stage, take them into your confidence, educate them slowly. With the next one, deepen their understanding, show them the significance of being in the non-dominant group. Make them think, show them the unfairness that actually exists in the system. And you know, I mean, this is not a perfect model, but, and you will find, and I have found that students are kind of mindset on one, typical statements of another. But you know, that's our job, I feel like, as educators, to kind of get to know them, right?
Yes. Yeah, and I would just say, just a quick example. I teach a class called Dance and Society, which I would say is sort of a global version of the traditional dance appreciation class. But one theme that permeates throughout is the theme of power, and how when different groups go to different geographies, they use their power to change the culture and the dances. And so how do they do that? So one thing we talked about is, you know, trying to identify with a particular group. You know, what if someone comes to where you are and they strip away everything that's familiar and valuable to you? You know, trying to get them to think about it from that perspective, instead of saying, you know, this was wrong, people shouldn't have done this, but how would that feel for you? So, and then we did other projects around that.
So these are kind of our classroom strategies: lead, deepen, get, elaborate on, encourage, and display. So kind of in this order, working with, and this came out of, I wanted to make sure, because I can become very passionate on this subject, just a little bit. So I wanted to make sure passion is great, but I have seen, when I do these steps out of order, for instance, I have found that I can alienate students. Right away, kind of a wall goes up a little bit, like, or they question, why are we talking about this? Or we've talked, what is that? There just seems to be maybe a little resistance, or they shy away from it. And I want to, again, engage and encourage them to engage in conversation and deep discussions, and not have them feel like what they say is wrong, or they can't say anything, or edit themselves too much. So again, you can see, this is what I have found has worked. Lead with the facts first. Over, you know, so and so many thousands of Africans, mostly from West Africa, not all were brought to the United States. They had to do this, this was that. They brought their culture. These are the dance and culture traditions. This is how they were treated. Lead with the facts first. None of my opinion or elaboration, just give the facts first. Then you start to deepen their understanding. Then you get them to agree that it's unfair and unjust, just on a general level. Then we can start to elaborate on the issue, but again, always making them think that it's not just what I said and what happened, but have them think and bring something to the table. Like Beth alluded to a second ago, encourage this role reversal. So how would you feel if this happened? And then display the passion with some opinion. And this is where I need to make sure as a professor that, in order to make sure that it's their discussion, yes, that it's maybe some of my opinion, but most of theirs. Yeah, this is for them to engage and to have these thoughtful discussions amongst each other.
And I think one thing that Joan and I have talked about a fair amount is the passion part, because we both get pretty passionate, but we have different responses based on who we are. And so one thing we've talked about is, as we get to that passion part, is trying to share a little bit of who you are, not just what you look like and why this is important to you. You know, for instance, and Joan's heard me say this a million times, when I've spoken with classes about the importance of Soul Train and how that conveyed culture and dance and music, you know, first of all, you know, we talk about how TV used to go off at 12 o'clock and they don't understand that. But, you know, and some of you are probably too young to remember that too. But then I can talk about, you know, I grew up in a little town in West Virginia where everybody looked like me. And for me to see Soul Train opened a new window to me, because that was the main way to see different people in different parts of culture that I wasn't getting in my everyday life. You know, students today have a very different experience with the internet, but it's not always been that way. So they, you know, it just helps them see that, you know, if they've had something where they feel like they've missed something. Why didn't I know this? What's wrong with me? It's not, it's just where you were and where you can decide where you want to go next.
Right.
And this last slide is just, we chose just a few examples of some specific classroom activities that we've done, and I'll let Joan talk about the first couple.
One of my favorites is, you know, a ball toss. I just take a piece of paper, and again, these come about just, again, because of the subject matter. You know, say it's like the second class, or maybe even at the end of the first class, or part of the first discussion. And students are a little uneasy about their responses or whatever. I just take a piece of paper and I pass it around. It's fun to do it timed, or you can start with several pieces of paper if you have a larger class, and they get to write. I ask a question, or I ask them for a response on what we're talking about. They don't write their name, they just write their response, or they may ask a question and they're worried about if their question is inappropriate. Anonymously, and then they ball it up and throw it to the next person. They all get to throw these balls at me later, which even at the college level they enjoy for some reason. And then, or they can throw it to each other and someone will open the piece of paper and ask the question. We don't know who it came from, or they can read the comment, and that can be either a topic of another discussion or we answer that question. It's just kind of a fun interactive, so it's not, and again, students tend to love the anonymous part of it. One of my favorites after a reading or after a discussion or a lecture of some sort, I do what I call the tell me something good. I won't sing it to you, but if you know Shaka Khan, I sing it in my impression of her. Anyway, students make 2 lines facing each other. They talk to each other. I do it timed also. So what was one nugget you got from the reading, or something you want to share about the topic, and then they rotate. Again, it's just another way, you know, we're into moving, so, and they expect to move. So the days that we don't move and there's lecturing, there's still that moment of, okay, synthesize the information, share it with a fellow student. And then if at the end, when there's time, I'll ask them, okay, so what did you learn new, or what was a new topic that came about? Just a couple things to, you know, just keep it different, just so we're not just sitting staring at each other.
And one thing that I have done, which we're calling group chat, usually more in a lecture-based course than in a studio-based course. If we've had a reading of something that I know is probably going to be a little challenging or new information for the students, is, you know, when they come in, you know, everybody grab a marker and just write an observation, question, anything you had from something we read or a video that we watched on the board. Don't put, it's all anonymous, similar to the ball toss. And then I'll put them in small groups, and then they get to choose in their groups any of the topics. So it doesn't have to be something that they observe, so it takes them that next layer removed. And then they discuss it, and then when we come back together and everybody shares what they talked about, and that usually sparks some really interesting multi-layer discussion. And because they're not talking about their own observation, it makes them feel more confident in delving in, and then hearing other people's responses again lets them know they're not alone in their question, or that this is new material for them, and also helps give them more perspective on what they were already thinking about. And then the last one,
and I
actually haven't used this.
I think we need to conclude.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but
okay.
But yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Nope.
You, but
sorry.
As people can see, Kahoot and all those other great
things.
Yep.
All right, so that's really it. So we just added our emails. That's all.
Thank you all so much. Appreciate it. I hated to stop any of the presentations because they're all so good. We are almost at time. We have maybe time for a question or two. I did want to let you all know, unfortunately, Kim had to go and deal with something else, so she's not able to be with us for the question and answer, but I'm going to drop her email in the chat if you want to follow up with her. But if there are any other questions that folks would like to ask, feel free to unmute and ask folks. Or we can all sit quietly, also fine. Beth, would you mind unsharing your screen?
Yep, if I can figure out how to do that. Hold on.
If you go down to the bottom, you should be able to.
I see a question here from Dr. Bird. Christy's asking Olivia, hold on. Dr. Bird is wondering, what plans do you have for a self-care journal, or for the self-care journal? Are you thinking of sharing that with the Women's Center or some community organizations?
That's a great question. I had originally, a couple of my professors had asked me to pass it along to particular students who they felt would benefit from it, and so I did that. I, in the beginning, was physically making the copies, and so it was a little bit harder to distribute, but I think that I have a digital copy somewhere that I could distribute online and let people print it out and create their own. But it just had some like mindfulness techniques and journal prompts, and was a little tool for like that I had found helpful. And so, yeah, I think I can try and make it available and then send it out to folks if anyone's interested. Thank you.
Olivia, I'll speak for Lisa LaBarbara Muscotti, who's also on this call. She is working with our graduate assistant, Shaniqua, to, Lisa, you might have to chime in, I forgot what y'all called it, but something similar to that could actually be useful that they're planning on publishing. And so I'll let Lisa chime in if she wants to do that, but that might be a great connection for the two of you.
Yeah, you might hear my son in the background now, but yeah, we're working on a radical self-love distance workshop during final exam week. So your presentation was excellent, and I really would look forward to seeing what you've put together. It sounds awesome.
Throw my email in the chat.
Angela, would you mind reminding folks how we can access all of this amazing content after today is over, because we're just about at the end of our session?
Yes, all the presentations, the recordings will be made available on the GERS website. So the go.ncsu.edu/GERS, everything will be made available there.
I just want to thank everyone so much. I feel so enlivened and inspired, especially with all the work that you all are doing. Thank you so much for sharing it. And thanks to everybody for being co-present in this virtual space. I just want to also honor Angela's work in making all of this happen, because transitioning from being in person to online was an enormous task and it's been a really lovely day. So just thank you to everybody for making that happen, and it's really an appreciation for all of you.
I am so grateful for y'all. I know we got to go, but these presentations were amazing, and I'm just grateful for the committee. Like, everyone are rock stars. So I just really want to acknowledge the work that has gone into today. From the committee to the presenters, every single one of you, I am completely astounded. I've been G-chatting Lisa on the side, like, I want this person, like literally all of y'all, like, y'all need to come back and do a presentation in the Women's Center. So I'm so grateful for you. Have an amazing rest of the week. Hopefully you're taking a day off tomorrow, and just enjoy your time. Be blessed. Wash your hands.
Yeah. All right, bye y'all.
All right, thanks.